Counts at this point, Dennis, thank you. Boycotting paradise because of politics. As we look at President Donald Trump's first 100 days in office, Floridians are now seeing less Canadians flock to the Sunshine State.
August 2025, Florida beach towns. Business owners calling it a ghost town. Revenue down 30%. Spring break never happened. Summer never came. And the governor stood at a tourism conference bragging about record numbers while restaurants closed early because nobody showed up. This isn't a slowdown. This is cognitive dissonance at the state level. Because while Ron DeSantis celebrates 34.4 million visitors in the second quarter, the people who actually depend on those tourists are watching their businesses die. The spreadsheets say success. The streets say something else entirely. For decades, Florida sold one story: sunshine, freedom, affordability, no state income tax, theme parks, miles of beaches, the place where Americans escaped winter and retirees lived the dream. And for years, it worked. In 2024, Florida welcomed 143 million visitors, a record, more than any year in history. Canadian visitors down over 100,000 in the first quarter alone. Airline tickets to Florida from Toronto dropped 76% in April compared to last year. International arrivals down 8.7% by August. Beach towns from Clearwater to Fort Lauderdale reporting the slowest season since the pandemic. And when business owners asked for help, the governor told them to be patient because according to him, everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. And by summer 2025, the gap between official numbers and economic reality had grown so wide that even DeSantis couldn't ignore it anymore. This is the story of how Florida's tourism engine stalled, how political rhetoric destroyed trust, and why the state that spent years mocking California's problems is now facing an exodus of its own. When the Sunshine State meant something, let's go back to what Florida used to be: the escape. The place where you could stretch a dollar, raise a family, and retire without breaking the bank. No state income tax meant more money in your pocket. Warm weather year-round meant no heating bills. And tourism meant jobs, lots of them. In 2019, Florida's tourism industry generated over 131 million visitors, nearly 10 million from overseas, over 4 million from Canada alone. Those weren't just numbers. Those were people renting condos for months, eating at local restaurants, shopping at small businesses, tipping service workers, fueling an entire coastal economy. Canadian snowbirds became the backbone of Florida's winter economy. They'd arrive in November and stay through March, renting homes in Fort Myers, Naples, Clearwater, Sarasota. They weren't just tourists passing through. They were part-time residents, a typical Canadian household spending $33,000 over the season. That's the economic power of 28 average American families combined. They kept restaurants open during slow months. They filled hotels when domestic travelers stayed home. They made Florida's tourism industry recession-proof, or so everyone thought. Then COVID hit, and Florida made a bet. While other states locked down, Florida stayed open. Governor DeSantis refused mask mandates, kept beaches accessible, allowed theme parks to reopen early. It was controversial, it was risky, but it worked. Tourists who couldn't go anywhere else came to Florida. Domestic travel surged. People escaping California and New York flooded in. By 2022, Florida was booming. Home prices skyrocketed. New residents poured in by the hundreds of thousands. Tourism hit all-time highs. DeSantis was hailed as the governor who saved the economy while everyone else panicked. But underneath that success, cracks were forming. The state's image was changing, not just economically, culturally, politically, rhetorically. And by 2024, those cracks would turn into fractures. The ghost towns nobody talks about. While DeSantis celebrated record tourism at press conferences, business owners were drowning. Let's talk about what was actually happening on the ground. Clearwater, St. Pete Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Panama City. These weren't just slow, they were empty. Kirsten Smale, a marine educator for Dolphin Quest, told ABC Action News, "Spring break really never happened for us. And then the summer swing never happened for us." Amber Simmons, general manager at Pirates Pub and Grub, said, "It's a ghost town. It's the slowest year we've had since 2020. Angela Wilson from Mad Beach. Water Sports said some of her peers saw business drop 30%. That's not a dip, that's a collapse. For small businesses operating on thin margins, a 30% revenue drop means layoffs, shortened hours, closed locations. Some businesses that survived the pandemic couldn't survive 2025. And it wasn't just one town, it was statewide. In Miami Beach, Mango's Tropical Cafe slashed hours and staffing. The owner said, "Everybody's income is down 30%. It's a bloodbath." Hospitality venues on Ocean Drive reported the same thing. Fewer customers, lower spending, empty tables during what should have been peak season. Lee County, home to Fort Myers, was still recovering from Hurricane Ian in 2022. By 2025, only 83% of hotel rooms were operational. Thousands of beds still out of commission. But even in areas unaffected by hurricanes, the story was the same. Revenue down, foot traffic down, optimism gone. The data backed it up. Florida's tourism saw 17.7 million arrivals from January to August 2025. That's an 8.7% decline compared to 19.4 million in 2024. August showed zero growth compared to the previous year. Then September dropped 10%. The summer peak that usually carried businesses through the year never materialized. And here's the twist, statewide numbers still looked okay. First quarter 2025 showed 41.193 million visitors, almost identical to first quarter 2024. So why were businesses dying? Because the composition of tourists had changed. Domestic travelers accounted for 92% of visitors. Many were drive-thrus. Day trippers, low-spending tourists booking packages through big hotel chains. They weren't shopping at local boutiques. They weren't eating at family-owned restaurants. They weren't renting from independent property owners. The high-spending international visitors, the snowbirds who stayed for months and fueled local economies, were gone. And nobody in Tallahassee was talking about it. The press conference that exposed everything. August 28, 2025. The Florida Governor's Conference on Tourism. DeSantis took the stage, cameras rolling, reporters ready, and he delivered a speech that perfectly captured the disconnect between Tallahassee and Main Street. We had a record-breaking number of 34.4 million visitors to the state of Florida, he said. That includes 31.5 million American visitors, 2.3 million overseas visitors, and 640,000 Canadian visitors. He smiled. He was proud, but the numbers told a different story. 640,000 Canadians in the second quarter of 2025, down from 739,000 in the second quarter of 2024. That's 99,000 fewer visitors, a 13% drop. But DeSantis framed it as a win because overall visitation hit a record. He said, "They said Canadians were going to stop coming to Florida. I didn't think that was true, and the numbers prove it." Except they didn't. The numbers showed exactly what critics had warned about. Canadians were pulling back fast. Then he pivoted to his favorite talking point, property tax relief funded by tourist dollars. This is part of the reason we're having a discussion about giving people generationally significant property tax relief, he said. I want Canadian tourists and Brazilian tourists subsidizing the state and making it so Florida residents pay less taxes. Same rhetoric, same branding problem. He wasn't inviting tourists. He was assigning them a role. Subsidizers, not guests. And reporters noticed. One asked if declining Canadian numbers concerned him. DeSantis dismissed it, said overseas visitors were up enough to offset the loss, which was technically true. Overseas visitors rose from 2 million in quarter 2 2024 to 2.3 million in quarter 2 2025. But those visitors weren't spending like Canadians. They stayed in resorts, booked all-inclusive packages, didn't filter down to local businesses. The gap wasn't being filled. It was being papered over with misleading data. Another reporter asked about small business owners reporting 30% revenue drops. DeSantis said he hadn't heard those complaints, that local economies were strong, that Florida's tourism brand had never been better. And when pressed about whether his rhetoric had damaged Florida's reputation internationally, he said, "People want to come to the free state of Florida. We're not changing our message. That press conference became a flashpoint. Business owners watching it felt abandoned. Tourism experts called it tone deaf, and international observers saw it as confirmation that Florida's leadership didn't understand or didn't care about the damage being done. The economic bloodletting nobody will admit. By October 2025, the numbers were undeniable. Florida's tourism decline wasn't a blip, it was a trend, and the economic damage was spreading. Travel and Tour World estimated Florida could lose up to $12.5 billion in tourism revenue by the end of 2025. Not because of hurricanes, not because of a recession, because of self-inflicted wounds, political rhetoric, diplomatic tensions, a failure to understand that tourism runs on trust. And once that trust is broken, it doesn't come back easily. Tourism associations started sounding alarms. Destinations Florida called for a coordinated response, marketing campaigns, diplomatic outreach, anything to stop the bleeding. But DeSantis resisted. He didn't want to admit there was a problem. Admitting the problem meant admitting his rhetoric had consequences, and that was politically unacceptable. So instead, Florida launched a $32 million marketing campaign aimed at domestic travelers. Tried to replace international tourists with Americans, but it didn't work. Domestic tourists were already maxed out, and they weren't spending like the international visitors they were supposed to replace. By November, the damage was clear. Tourism jobs in Southwest Florida dropped despite busy beaches. Hotels were full, but restaurants were empty. People were coming to Florida. They just weren't spending money. And that distinction mattered more than any headline number. Florida's loss became other states' opportunity, and what followed was one of the most aggressive tourism battles in modern American history. California launched California Loves Canada, offered discounts up to 25%. Palm Springs raised 40 heart-shaped Canadian flags in a symbolic show of affection. It was performative, but it worked. Canadians started booking trips to Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco instead of Miami and Tampa. New York joined the fight, Illinois, Louisiana, even Texas. Every state that lost international visitors during the Trump administration scrambled to win them back. And Florida, the state that should have dominated this competition, was losing ground. Because while other states were rolling out welcome mats, Florida's governor was telling foreign tourists they existed to subsidize residents' tax cuts. But the real competition wasn't between U.S. states. It was between the U.S. and the rest of the world. According to CBC, many Canadians skipped America entirely, chose Mexico, Portugal, the Caribbean, Europe, places where they felt valued, where political rhetoric didn't make them feel like walking ATMs. And once that shift happened, it became self-reinforcing. Canadians who went to Mexico told their friends, posted photos, shared experiences, created new travel patterns that didn't include Florida. The irony was brutal. Florida spent decades building a brand, the go-to winter destination for Canadians, then destroyed it in less than 2 years, all because leadership couldn't separate political rhetoric from economic reality. The collapse? Florida won't call a collapse. As of November 2025, Florida's tourism industry faces a crisis it refuses to name. The data is clear. International arrivals down, Canadian visitors down 40% in some months. Small businesses reporting 30% revenue drops. Tourism jobs disappearing despite steady visitor counts. And a governor who keeps celebrating records while the people who depend on tourism are struggling to survive. This isn't a story about a hurricane, or a recession, or bad luck. This is a story about choices. Political choices, rhetorical choices, branding choices, and the consequences of those choices are playing out in empty restaurants, closed shops, and furloughed workers across the state. Florida built an economy on sunshine and hospitality, then replaced hospitality with hostility. Told international visitors they were welcome as long as they paid more taxes than residents. And now, those visitors are going elsewhere. The scary part? This might just be the beginning. Winter 2025 to 2026 is the real test. That's when snowbirds traditionally arrive, when Canadian retirees book 3-month stays, when small businesses make enough money to survive the slower summer months. If this winter season collapses the way summer did, the damage won't be temporary. It'll be structural. Businesses that close this year won't reopen next year. Workers who leave the industry won't come back, and the reputation Florida spent decades building will take decades to rebuild. DeSantis keeps saying, Florida is the free state. That freedom is the brand, but freedom without welcome is just isolation, and isolation doesn't attract tourists. It repels them. The question now is whether Florida's leadership will recognize the damage before it's too late, or whether they'll keep celebrating misleading numbers while the tourism economy quietly dies beneath the surface. This is the story of how Florida's governor panicked as tourists abandoned the state, not because of a crisis he couldn't control, but because of a crisis he created, and why the people who built Florida's tourism industry are now paying the price for decisions they never made. If this breakdown opened your eyes to what's really happening in Florida, hit that subscribe button, because this story isn't over. More states are facing tourism collapses. More political decisions are destroying local economies. More small businesses are being sacrificed for headlines. And you'll want to see what happens next.